Few people realize that Aleister Crowley is not only the father of modern Satanism, but the father of modern culture as well. Crowley, whose house overlooked Loch Ness and was bought by guitarist Jimmy Page, has for good reason also been called the other Loch Ness Monster. Crowley, who in his book Magic had admitted to sacrificing hundreds of children to Satan, was run out of Italy and called by the press of his day the wickedest man on earth. Crowley claimed that a demonic spirit he later identified as Satan himself dictated a book to him in 1904 called the Book of the Law. Under the heading The Law of Thelema, the Book of the Law declares, "This book lays down a simple code of conduct. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is a law, love under will. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt." Echoing Satan's arrogant boast, "I will exalt my throne above the stars of God," the book centers around the imposition of satanic self-will in defiance of divine will. Aleister Crowley, elaborating on the satanic doctrine of do what thou wilt, declared, quote, "I say today, to hell with Christianity. I will build me a new heaven and a new earth. I want blasphemy, murder, rape, revolution, anything bad, etc." As we shall see, Crowley's do what thou wilt was really do what Satan or Crowley wilt. Crowley taught that one could become a genius in music through practicing his Satanism. Crowley taught that his satanic doctrine should be cloaked under the lie of love, and he believed the youth would fall for it. If Timothy Leary was Crowley's drug guru of the 1960s, Leary dubbed John Lennon and the Beatles as the four evangelists. The Beatles wrote the song Come Together as a campaign song for Leary's hopeful presidential bid that, thank God, never got off the ground. Crowley taught that he was to be the leader of a youth army and ended up finding himself on the front cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album.
It was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
The song states that it was 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. The album came out in 1967. Crowley had died 20 years earlier in 1947, the year Leary claimed he passed on the baton to him to bring in the Satanic Revolution. This made Sgt. Pepper a likely reference to Aleister Crowley, the father of the new eon. John Lennon summed up the entire Beatle philosophy before his death by quoting Satanist Aleister Crowley. Lennon stated, "The whole Beatle idea was to do what you want, right? Do what thou wilt." Sgt. Pepper's has been considered the greatest concept album in the history of music. In a few moments, we'll see what this concept was really all about.
I mean, you go back and listen to Sgt. Pepper's, they were brilliant.
Sgt. Pepper changed the world.
In 1964, rock's most popular group of all time came singing, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And after the world's youth gave their hand to them, they took them on a journey into drugs, permissive sex, Eastern mysticism, and Satanism.
When the Beatles came around, everybody freaked. They just loved the look, they loved the music. It really revolutionized the way people dressed. It revolutionized the way people wore their hair. It started, I think, a revolution in America.
It is hard to overestimate the impact that the Beatles had on the world at large, as youth by the millions were given a form of emotional shock treatment.
They influenced everything that I've ever done.
I even remember, growing up hearing Beatles songs, and all their songs are timeless.
They built the structure for rock and roll.
The Beatles actually were bringing everybody along with them on their voyage of their discovery.
The Beatles went out and took the world by storm.
I grew up with them. They helped us grow up. They got me arrested 3 or 4 times.
I think they did a lot for society.
Those songs are in my memory banks I think they're actually my genetic material.
All-time favorite musical group?
Beatles.
If they dressed a certain way, everybody wanted to be like that.
When the Beatles got long hair, I got long hair. The fact that my mother didn't like it was an enormous part of its appeal.
Millions were seduced by the music and image of the Beatles to trade in their biblical values for Crowleyan ideals.
I had this theory that the Beatles were actually the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That insofar as they changed the entire face of the planet.
If people know it or not, they've all been influenced by the Beatles, in our generation, because we've grown up having that be a normal part of our culture.
Reluctance to go back to an old deferential culture is exactly, you could see what the Beatles represent, because if the Beatles were one thing, they were disrespectful.
The 1960s were the perfect time for Satan to introduce his revolution. He had already established his groundwork through men like Harry Hay and Kinsey and Timothy Leary. Both Kennedy and Martin Luther King were shot dead, and the environment was ripe for revolution as the baby boomer generation was living in a spiritual vacuum.
What was happening at the same time was, of course, the boomer generation growing up. So you suddenly had a very large, very young population, really for the first time. And the music just fed into that. So you've got all these things coming together, and then you always have to add to that the imponderable factor of individual brilliance.
Yoko Ono said that the Beatles were not aware of all that was coming through them. She said they were like four mediums at a seance who had gathered together, and a spirit appeared and channeled through them. We have already noted that John Lennon summed up the Beatle revolution when he quoted Aleister Crowley and said that the whole Beatle idea was, quote, do what thou wilt. The Beatles brought this message through the music to the masses, and they gobbled it up.
It sort of set fire to a whole lot of things, gases that were ready to be ignited. And it said, yes, you can do things. Come on, let's just do it. Let's take over. Let's join this ride. The Beatles came along and everything changed. It became about young people will decide what goes on. Young people will decide how we dress. Young people will decide the music we make. And all of that culture, which we now take for granted, happened for the first time then.
I think the music of the Beatles had a phenomenal effect upon the whole world.
It was through the influence of the Beatles that millions of youth around the world were almost overnight turned away from Christ to the gurus of the East. Gurus like the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi were given a platform to pass out mantras like candy to the youth. Hippie youth began repeating these mantras, believing that they were in some way scientific, when in fact they were calling out on the names of Hindu gods and demons. Yoga is actually a word that means to yoke and speaks of yoking with pagan gods. God's word warns that these false gods are actually demonic beings, and Jesus Christ warned against the repetitious praying of the pagans.
Well, before the Beatles came around, I don't think Indian spirituality and things like that were an everyday part of Western culture. It was entirely the hippies, thanks to the Beatles, who decided to, go to India and, discover yoga and meditation. Now we all have yoga on every corner. There was never anything like that before they came along.
They really wanted a spiritual revolution, a transformation.
It was time for a generation to assert themselves. And this is the revolution that the Beatles caused.
This revolution was challenged after John Lennon claimed to be more popular than Jesus Christ. This was a wake-up call to many young people around the world as they took to the streets and publicly destroyed their Beatle albums.
Don't you forget what the Beatles have said. And don't forget to take your Beatle records and your Beatle paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pickup points.
Sadly, this wake-up call did not last very long, as society at large fell back asleep and the Beatles would launch their next assault with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In the 1960s, the Rolling Stones and their entourage made major steps in advancing Crowley's Satanic revolution. They worked with the Beatles and one of Crowley's most rabid disciples, Kenneth Anger, to promote Crowley's new age of Antichrist. Incredibly, Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones did the sound for Kenneth Anger's movie Invocation of My Demon Brother, promoting Aleister Crowley's Satanism. Kenneth Anger described the film as, quote, the shadowing forth of the Lord Lucifer as the powers gather at a midnight mass. Both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones appear as seen here in Anger's film. Tony Sanchez, who lived with the Rolling Stones, related how Jagger, Richards, and their girlfriends, Faithful and Pallenberg, quote, listened spellbound as Anger turned them on to Crowley's powers and ideas. We have already observed that Keith Richards boasted that, quote, Kenneth Anger told me I was his right-hand man. Jagger's girlfriend, Marian Faithfull, said that Jagger harnessed all of the negative forces into entities: Lucifer, Jumping Jack Flash, the dark, violent group mind of the crowd chaos, Pan, terms used by Crowley for his satanic revolution in his books. She said that frenzied power caused many of the casualties of the 60s. Kenneth Anger's demonic movies were basically a promotion of Crowley's satanic philosophy of do what thou wilt. Here we see Kenneth Anger dancing around with a goat's head, which is a powerful symbol in Satanism even to this day. Subsequent to this movie, the Rolling Stones would put out an album called Goat's Head Soup. Jesus Christ said of the destiny of the wicked at the final judgment that the goats who would be put on God's left hand would be thrown into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Kenneth Anger said, making movies is casting spells, capturing people. I consider myself working evil in an evil medium. Church of Satan leader Anton LaVey, who co-founded the Church of Satan with Kenneth Anger, also helped with the movie. Anton LaVey admitted that he and his cohorts were actually involved in the Manson slayings through satanic ritual. Anton LaVey depicted the satanic majesty in the movie, or representation of Satan, in Anger's Crowleyan infomercial. Bobby Beausoleil, formerly of the rock band Love and Magic, depicted Lucifer in the film. Beausoleil was one of Anger's sex partners and is now in prison for one of the Manson family murders. Lucifer Rising was yet another film that the Rolling Stones' entourage helped with to promote Crowley's Satanism. The music was originally composed by Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin and then by Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. Anger finally settled for the music of Bobby Beausoleil of the Manson family. Kenneth Anger described the film as, quote, a presentation of Anita Pallenberg, who was the common-law wife of Keith Richards of the Stones. Marianne Faithfull depicted Lilith in the film and is seen here ascending up a mountain to be part of a human sacrifice. Kenneth Anger said, I was going to film a version of Lucifer Rising with the Stones. All the roles were to be carefully cast, with Mick being Lucifer and Keith as Beelzebub. Kenneth Anger said that the occult unit within the Rolling Stones was Keith and Anita and Brian. I believe that Anita, for want of a better word, is a witch. Brian was a witch too. He said in another time they would have burned me. He was very happy about that. Marianne Faithfull said, I knew that by simply being in the film, I was involving myself in an act far more potent than Satanism. I used to feel that a lot of the bad luck in my life came from that film. Kenneth Anger said that Lilith climbs to the place of sacrifice, the Magus activates the circle, and Lucifer, bringer of light, breaks through. Throughout the film, there are different images promoting Crowley's doctrine of human sacrifice. Here we see a man with a jacket with Lucifer emblazoned across it in an upside-down triangle with a rainbow. Anger apparently used the inverted triangle to express the inversion of God's creation. This inversion is expressed heavily in the homosexual themes that run throughout his movies. The upside-down triangle with the rainbow would come to be used by the homosexual movement as one of their symbols. We now know that Crowleyites like Harry Hay, Alfred Kinsey, and Kenneth Anger were the major conspirators behind the modern-day homosexual movement. In Lucifer Rising, the disciples are seen unveiling a portrait of their leader, Aleister Crowley, and drawing knives for the bloody revolution. Aleister Crowley said that there would be a bloody revolution to usher in the new age of Antichrist. Tony Sanchez said of Mick Jagger, I realized then that he genuinely wanted to see society overthrown, that he felt a revolution coming, and that he saw the Stones as a vanguard of a historical bloody period of change. The Stones sing of the Satanic Revolution. In their song Street Fighting Man, they sing, hey, think the time is right for a palace revolution. I'll shout and scream, I'll kill the king. Now is the time for violent revolution. Few people actually realize that the teachings of Satanist Aleister Crowley are the basis of so much of what is behind modern culture today. And how did Marianne Faithfull respond when asked about how their Crowleyan ideas would destroy society?
Everybody did what you seem to be advocating. Do you not agree that the whole structure of our society would just collapse?
Yeah, wouldn't it have been lovely? I think I'm really powerful.
John Lennon of the Beatles, who knew Kenneth Anger, pretended to be a man of peace, but really wanted violent revolution. John Lennon said that the Beatles were as much revolutionaries as the Stones were. Notice John Lennon here after stating, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out, then changes out to in, showing the Beatles' true intent for violent revolution.
But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?
The Rolling Stones and the Beatles promoted Crowley's Satanic Revolution with their albums, Their Satanic Majesty's Request and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. With their Satanic Majesty's Request, the Stones employed the same name for Satan as did Anger's film Lucifer Rising. On the front cover of the album, Mick Jagger is seen dressed like a warlock, and at the top of the album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, we see the alignment of planets supposedly heralding the Crowleyan Satanic Age. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones said at this time, quote, I believe we're moving toward a new age in ideas and events. Astrologically, we are at the end of the age called the Pisces Age, of the beginning of which people like Christ were born. We're soon to begin the age of Aquarius, in which events as important as those at the beginning of Pisces are likely to occur. There is a young revolution in thought and manner about to take place. What few people realize is that Their Satanic Majesty's Request was put out in conjunction with the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album to promote the new age of Satan. Both came out in 1967, both were highly psychedelic, and both were poised to take the hippie revolution further down the path of Crowley's Satanic Revolution. Both albums are also heavily adorned with Eastern mystical symbols and drugs. Both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are wearing uniforms, and both are pictured with deadpan looks upon their faces. Notice on the front cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's is the statement, "Welcome the Rolling Stones." Tony Sanchez wrote in his book Up and Down with the Rolling Stones about a Beatles or Rolling Stones meeting where they talked, quote, long into the night about music and revolution and how they were going to change the world. On the front cover of the Rolling Stones album, their Satanic Majesty's Request, a slightly veiled picture of John Lennon is seen. This same picture is also found on the inside sleeve of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. On the Stones album, we also see a semi-camouflage picture of George Harrison of the Beatles, his head being covered with magic mushrooms, a biblically forbidden doorway to Satan called pharmakia. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album is covered with a collage of people known as the Magic Crowd. These are the faces of different people that the Beatles considered part of the mystical club. The Beatles described them as their heroes and people they looked up to. In this crowd, you find pictures of one-worlders like Karl Marx and mystics like Edgar Allan Poe and Carl Jung and Aldous Huxley, who Crowley reportedly turned on to mescaline. The Beatles also placed a picture of occultist William Burroughs, who claimed to have become demon-possessed after killing his wife on the Sgt. Pepper's album. Also making the cast was the most popular starlet of the 1960s, Jane Mansfield. Mansfield was a high priestess in Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. Mansfield admitted to using her Satanism to both seduce and gain worldwide fame. The Beatles also placed a slew of Eastern gurus on the album as they continued their assault on Christianity. Incredibly, one of the people who was to be pictured on the album as part of the Beatles club was none other than Adolf Hitler. Hitler was yanked presumably because he was considered too controversial to appear on the album. Hitler's picture can be seen on the sidelines just prior to the shooting of the album cover. It has been well documented that Nazism was rooted in the occultic teachings of Madame Blavatsky and others. Aleister Crowley claimed that Hitler was his disciple and was seeking to implement the teachings of the Book of the Law through his policies of the triumph of the will. And of course, as we have noted on the top left, we find the picture of none other than Aleister Crowley. It is believed that Crowley is the one that the Beatles are referring to when in the song Sgt. Pepper's they state it was 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. It was 20 years before the release of this album, almost to the day when Crowley died, and many of his followers believed marked the beginning of the New Age. Crowley declared that he would lead an army of youth in the revolution to implement the New Age, and apparently the Beatles dubbed him Sgt. Pepper. John Lennon stated, there were very few things that happened to the Beatles that weren't really well thought out. Lennon said that he realized that he was part of a club of mystics who had been initiated into the same spiritual club. God's word in the book of Revelation describes Satan's church as the whore of Babylon. She is depicted as a sorceress, and Revelation chapter 17 verse 4 states, quote, the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. A depiction of the Satanic Church, or the Scarlet Woman, as both Crowley and Anger refer to her, is found on the Sgt. Pepper's album. Crowley taught that the Beast and the Scarlet Woman would gather their children into their fold and bring the glories of the stars into the hearts of men. Notice on the Sgt. Pepper's album, we see a sorceress adorned in scarlet and with precious stones and gold and pearls. Notice also that she is holding up a golden cup in her hand, as the book of Revelation states. Notice in her other hand, she's holding an upside-down pentagram. The London Times said that Sgt. Pepper's was, quote, a decisive moment in the history of Western civilization. It was a decisive moment at this time in history as Satan made major inroads in preparing the world for the coming of the Antichrist. Ringo Starr, in a takeoff from Sgt. Pepper's, put out an album where he is seen with a demon or a fallen angel. Ringo Starr seems to be conveying the idea that he is being influenced by this spirit. In fact, at the top of this album, we see that Ringo Starr depicts himself as merely a puppet on the wizard's hand. God's word says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, like Ringo Starr, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world and spiritual wickedness in high places. Demonic beings who are using human beings to advance Satan's agenda.
I mean, you know, that summer of love, a lot of that was bull. Really, it was all what the press was saying.
After the 1960s had passed, George Harrison of the Beatles would admit that the so-called love of the hippie movement was a delusion that was really destructive.
You know, I went to Haight-Ashbury expecting it to be this brilliant place, and it was just full of horrible, spotty,
dropout kids on drugs. It certainly showed me what was really happening in the drug cult. It wasn't what I thought of all these groovy people having spiritual awakenings and being autistic. It was like the Bowery. It was like alcoholism. It was like any addiction.
Perhaps the best example to date of the evil and destructive fruit of Aleister Crowley's satanic teaching of do what thou wilt is Charles Manson.
If I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left. Because my children are coming. My children are coming.
Charles Manson, the world's most notorious mass murderer, was influenced both by Aleister Crowley and the Beatles. Charles Manson used the Beatles' music like Helter Skelter from the Sgt. Pepper's album to encourage the Satanic Revolution among the family. The Manson family, as they would butcher Sharon Tate and her baby and several other people, would paint the words Helter Skelter on the inside of the houses with the victims' blood. Susan Atkins stated that Manson would use the Beatles' albums to encourage them to murder.
Charlie played the Beatles' White Album incessantly. He would show us how they switched the word out to in when talking about destruction and how they were encouraging the revolution.
Susan Atkins, who was convicted of 8 of the Manson family murders, told me in our exclusive interviews that she remembers Crowley's name coming up when she was in the Manson family.
I remember Aleister Crowley's name being brought up when I was part of Manson's family. Manson's philosophy, like Crowley's, was do what thou wilt.
Carl Raschke, in his book Painted Black, states, quote, "It is known that Manson had a close association with the remnants of Crowley's organizational structure, the OTO, in Southern California. Members of the Manson family have admitted to butchering as many as 35 different people. Here we see a picture of Bobby Beausoleil, who was a follower of Manson and convicted of the first of the Manson family murders after killing Gary Hinman. Beausoleil is seen here in a long black cape, standing before Crowley's credo, do what thou wilt. Beausoleil was a frontman of his rock group he formed and called Magic, the Powerhouse of Oz, which he spelled with Crowley's characteristic K at the end. Beausoleil's band, the Magic Powerhouse of Oz, is seen here under a skull with the number of the Antichrist, 666, underneath it. Beausoleil also played guitar with Charles Manson, as together they indoctrinated the Manson family members with the satanic philosophy. Manson's music was filled with Crowley's doctrines for the new eon, as they sang about free sex, drugs, mysticism, revolution, and about doing your own thing.
You can do what you want to do, 'cause you're strong in your mind.